The smoke rose thick and black from the burning documents. General Heinrich Kramer watched his adjutant throw another stack of papers into the fire. Outside the small farmhouse that served as their command post, the rumble of American tanks grew louder. It was May 8th, 1945. The war was over, but the dying had not stopped. Kramer was 52 years old. He had fought in the First World War as a young lieutenant. He had served Germany for 30 years. Now he stood in the ruins of the Third Reich, waiting for the end. Around him, other high-ranking officers prepared for what they all believed would be their final hours. General Otto Brandt stood by the window, his iron cross still pinned to his uniform. He had commanded panzer divisions across France and Russia. His tanks had rolled through villages and cities, crushing everything in their path. Now those same tanks were scrap metal scattered across Europe. Brandt was 55, a career soldier who knew only one life. That life was ending. Colonel Ernst Richter was the youngest at 38. He had been a teacher before the war, but Hitler's rise changed everything. Richter joined the Wehrmacht and rose quickly through the ranks. He was clever and brave, but those qualities meant nothing now. He sat at a wooden table, staring at a photograph of his wife and 2 children. Would he ever see them again? General Friedrich Weber paced the room like a caged animal. He had defended Normandy Beach against the Allied invasion in June 1944. For weeks, his men held the line against impossible odds. When the line finally broke, Weber retreated with what remained of his division. He was a proud man who had never surrendered in his life. Today, he would have no choice. Major Klaus Steiner, the intelligence officer, burned the last of the maps. He had seen the reports. He knew what the Soviets did to German officers they captured. In the East, captured generals faced firing squads or slow death in frozen work camps. The Americans were different, everyone said, but how different? The propaganda ministry had spent years telling Germans that all enemies were brutal savages. Could any of it be true? "They are here," Brandt said from the window. The sound of engines stopped outside. Doors slammed. Boots hit the ground. American voices shouted commands in English. Kramer straightened his uniform and adjusted his cap. If he was going to die, he would die as a German officer. He would show no fear. The door burst open. 6 American soldiers entered with rifles raised. A young lieutenant followed them, no more than 25 years old. His uniform was clean, his face hard. He looked at the 5 German officers with cold eyes. "Hands up," the lieutenant said in broken German. "You are prisoners now." They raised their hands. American soldiers searched them roughly, taking their pistols, their knives, their papers. One soldier removed Kramer's iron cross and dropped it into a bag. 30 years of service, gone into a canvas sack. Another soldier found Weber's wedding ring and took that too. Outside, the lieutenant ordered. They walked out into the spring morning. The sun was shining. Birds were singing in the trees, as if the world had not just torn itself apart. More American soldiers stood in formation. A captain watched them with crossed arms. Behind him sat 2 large trucks with canvas covers. The captain stepped forward. He was older than the lieutenant, perhaps 40. His uniform had multiple ribbons and medals. He had seen combat, real combat. He studied each German officer carefully. "You are being transported to a collection point," the captain said in better German than the lieutenant. "If you cooperate, you will not be harmed. If you resist, you will be shot. Do you understand?" "We understand," Kramer replied. "Good. Get in the trucks." They climbed into the back of the first truck. American soldiers climbed in after them, rifles across their laps. The canvas cover blocked most of the light. In the dimness, Kramer could see his fellow officers. Their faces showed the same thoughts. This was the beginning of the end. The truck started moving. No one spoke. The road was rough, damaged by years of war. They bounced and swayed with each pothole. Kramer tried to guess where they were going. North? South? Did it matter? One prison was like another. One execution yard was like another. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. Kramer's legs cramped from sitting. His throat was dry. The American guards shared water among themselves, but offered none to the prisoners. It was a small cruelty, but it reminded them of their status. They were defeated enemies. They deserved nothing. Richter closed his eyes, and seemed to pray. Weber sat with his jaw clenched, refusing to show any weakness. Brandt stared at the canvas cover, lost in thought. Steiner counted his breaths, a technique to stay calm. Kramer thought about his wife, Anna. He had not seen her in 8 months. She was in Hamburg with their daughter. Was the city still standing? The British had bombed Hamburg so many times. Thousands had died in the firestorms. His last letter from Anna was 3 weeks old. She wrote about hunger, about fear, about American troops approaching. She asked if he was safe. He had lied and said yes. Now he would never write to her again. The Americans would send a telegram. General Heinrich Kramer, prisoner of war, deceased. No details. No explanation. Just another German officer who paid the price for following Hitler. The truck stopped suddenly. The guards stood up, rifles ready. The canvas cover was pulled back, and harsh sunlight flooded in. An American sergeant looked at them. "End of the line," he said. "Welcome to your new home." They climbed out stiffly. Kramer blinked in the bright light, trying to see where they were. What he saw made no sense at all. General Heinrich Kramer expected to see a prison yard. He expected concrete walls and barbed wire and guard towers with machine guns. He expected the cold efficiency of a military execution ground. Instead, he saw wooden barracks painted white. He saw neat pathways lined with stones. He saw pine trees swaying in a warm breeze that smelled nothing like Germany. "Where are we?" Weber whispered. Nobody answered because nobody knew. The American sergeant gestured for them to follow. They walked past a sign that read Camp Clinton in bold letters. Mississippi, United States of America. Kramer's mind reeled. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean? When? How long had they been unconscious in the truck? No, that was impossible. They must have been transferred to a ship at some point, but he had no memory of it. The processing building was clean and organized. American military police sat behind desks with typewriters and filing cabinets. A photographer set up his camera. One by one, the German officers were called forward. They stood against a white wall while the camera flashed. Their names were recorded. Their ranks were noted. Their fingerprints were taken with ink pads. An American colonel entered the room. He was tall and gray-haired, with a quiet authority that reminded Kramer of his own commanding officers from the old days before Hitler. The colonel spoke in slow, careful German. "Gentlemen, you are now prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will not be tortured or executed. You will have the right to send and receive mail through the Red Cross. Do you understand?" Kramer heard the words, but could not process them. The Geneva Convention was something armies discussed in peacetime. Nobody followed those rules in real war. Everyone knew that. The Soviets certainly did not follow them. The rumors from the Eastern Front spoke of horrors beyond imagination. German prisoners worked to death in Siberian mines. Officers shot in the back of the head and buried in mass graves. "This is a trick," Brandt muttered in German. "They want us to relax before the interrogation." The colonel seemed to understand some of what Brandt said. He smiled, but it was not a cruel smile. "No trick, General Brandt. You will see." They were led to their barracks. The building had a peaked roof and windows with actual glass. Inside were rows of beds with thin mattresses and folded blankets. Each bed had a small wooden locker beside it. The floor was swept clean. Everything was orderly and military, but not cruel. Kramer was assigned a bed near the window. Weber took the bed next to him. They sat down slowly, testing the mattresses as if they might be booby traps. The beds were real. The blankets were real. Through the window, Kramer could see other prisoners walking freely in a fenced yard. They wore clean uniforms with PW painted on the back in white letters. "Prisoner of war." "Look," Richter said, pointing outside that a group of German officers played volleyball on a dirt court. They laughed and shouted in German. Guards watched from a distance, but did not interfere. One prisoner hit the ball over the net. Another dove to save it and missed. His teammates groaned and teased him. It looked like a normal afternoon in military base, not a prison camp. "I do not understand," Steiner said. "None of this makes sense." An American private appeared at the door. He was young, maybe 19, with red hair and freckles. He looked nervous, speaking to the German generals. "Dinner is in 1 hour," he said in English. Then he repeated it in badly pronounced German. "Essen, 1 hour." After he left, the 5 officers sat in silence. Each man wrestled with the same confusion. The propaganda had been so clear. The Americans were soft and weak, but they were also cruel to prisoners. The Soviets were barbaric monsters. The British were cold and vengeful. Every German soldier knew these things. Except now, sitting in a clean barracks in Mississippi, those certainties crumbled. Weber stood and walked to the window. Maybe they only treat generals this way. The regular soldiers probably suffer in different camps. Maybe, Kramer said, but he did not believe it. There was something different here. Something unexpected. A bell rang across the camp. The American private returned. "Time for dinner. Follow me, please." They followed him across the compound to a large building that served as a mess hall. Inside, long tables filled with German prisoners of all ranks. Lieutenants sat with sergeants. Captains sat with corporals. Everyone wore the same POW uniform. Everyone had the same tin plate and cup. The American cooks served food from behind counter. Real food. Beef stew with vegetables. Bread with butter. Coffee that was weak but hot. An apple for dessert. Kramer took his portion and found a seat. He ate slowly, watching everything. The guards stood along the walls but did not hassle the prisoners. One guard even helped an old German sergeant who had trouble carrying his tray. "This food is better than what we ate in the Wehrmacht during the final months," Richter said quietly. "Remember? We were down to black bread and potato soup." It was true. The last year of the war had been desperate. Supply lines collapsed. Soldiers starved. Civilians starved. Everyone starved except the high party officials. And now here, in an American prison camp, they ate beef stew and fresh bread. After dinner, they were allowed to walk in the recreation yard for 1 hour before lights out. Kramer walked alone, processing everything. Other prisoners approached him cautiously. They had heard that new generals arrived. Word spread quickly in any military setting that a Luftwaffe captain stopped him. "General Kramer, I knew your reputation. You commanded the 12th Army Group. Is it true about Berlin? Did Hitler really die?" "It is true," Kramer said. "He took poison in his bunker. Germany has surrendered unconditionally." The captain's face showed no surprise. "We heard rumors. So it is really over." "Yes, it is over. And now what?" Kramer looked around the camp. At the clean barracks. At the guards who did not beat them. At prisoners playing cards and smoking cigarettes. "Now we wait and see what the Americans do with us." That night, lying in his bed, Kramer stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring more surprises, he was certain. Nothing about this captivity matched his expectations. The morning sun came through the window and woke General Heinrich Kramer. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then he remembered. Mississippi, America, prisoner of war camp. He sat up and looked around the barracks. Other German officers were already awake, making their beds with military precision. Old habits never died. Even in captivity, a whistle blew outside. An American sergeant called out in German. "Roll call in 15 minutes. Formation in the main yard." They dressed and joined hundreds of other prisoners assembling in neat rows. An American officer counted them while guards watched from elevated platforms. The count matched the records. The officer dismissed them to breakfast. The whole process took 20 minutes. Efficient and professional, just like any military morning. Over the next weeks, Kramer began to understand the rhythm of camp life. Morning roll call, work assignments, lunch, recreation time, dinner, evening activities, lights out at 10. The structure was familiar and strangely comforting. It gave order to their imprisonment. The work assignments surprised him most. German prisoners were asked to help maintain the camp. Some worked in the gardens, growing vegetables. Others repaired buildings or painted fences. A few with carpentry skills built furniture. And for this work, they received payment. Actual American dollars. Not much, maybe 10 cents a day, but real money they could use in the camp store to buy cigarettes, candy, or writing paper. "They pay us to work," Weber said, shaking his head. "I have never heard of such madness. We are prisoners. The Geneva Convention requires it, explained a German doctor who had been in the camp for 6 months. The Americans follow their rules very carefully. They document everything. Kramer was assigned to the camp library. His job was to organize books and help other prisoners find reading material. The library had books in German and English, history, science, literature, even some philosophy. There were newspapers too, American newspapers that prisoners could read. The news was often weeks old, but it was uncensored. They could read about the war trials starting in Nuremberg. They could read about Germany's occupation. They could read about the devastation of Europe. One newspaper showed photographs from the concentration camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, mountains of corpses, living skeletons behind barbed wire, mass graves. The images made Kramer physically ill. He had known about the camps, but not the full scale, not the industrial efficiency of the killing. 6 million Jews murdered, millions of others, Poles, Russians, disabled people, homosexuals, political prisoners, all dead. Lies, an old colonel said, looking at the photographs over Kramer's shoulder. Allied propaganda to justify their bombing of our cities. But Kramer knew they were not lies. He'd seen the SS units. He had heard the rumors. He had chosen not to ask questions because asking questions was dangerous under Hitler. Now the truth surrounded him in black and white photographs. Germany had not just lost a war. Germany had committed unspeakable crimes. Major Robert Hayes came to the library one afternoon. He was the camp's intelligence officer, a man in his mid-30s who spoke excellent German. He sat down across from Kramer at one of the reading tables. "General Kramer, I hope you are settling in well," Hayes said. "As well as one can in a prison," Kramer replied carefully. Hayes smiled. "This must be different from what you expected." "Very different. May I ask you some questions?" "Nothing about military secrets. Those do not matter now. I am simply trying to understand." Kramer tensed, but Hayes seemed genuine. "What do you want to know?" "Your career. You graduated from military academy in 1913. You fought in the First War. You commanded troops in Poland, France, and Russia. You were respected by your men. Why did you follow Hitler?" The question was direct and honest. Kramer thought carefully before answering. At first, Hitler promised to restore Germany. After the First War, we were humiliated. The Versailles Treaty took everything from us. Our economy collapsed. People starved. Hitler promised jobs and pride and strength. We believed him. By the time we understood what he truly was, it was too late to stop. Hayes nodded. "And the Jews? The camps? Did you know?" "I knew there were camps. I knew Jews were being sent away. I told myself they were being resettled. I did not ask questions. I should have asked questions." Kramer felt shame burn in his chest. "I was a coward. I followed orders and did not ask questions." "That is honest," Hayes said. "More honest than most. Do you understand why we are treating you this way? Why we follow the Geneva Convention even after everything Germany did?" "No," Kramer admitted. "I did not understand. We killed your men. We fought against everything America claims to value. We committed terrible crimes. Why show us mercy?" Hayes leaned forward. "Because we are not fighting people, General. We are fighting ideas. The idea that might makes right. The idea that some humans are worth less than others. The idea that the ends justify any means. If we become like our enemies, we lose even when we win. Our values must mean something even in war. Especially in war." The word struck Kramer deeply. In the Wehrmacht, they had been taught that war was total. That victory required any sacrifice, any method, any cruelty. The Americans thought differently. They believed in limits even in war. They believed in rules that applied to everyone, even enemies. Over the following weeks, Kramer attended some of the educational programs the camp offered. English classes taught by American soldiers. Lectures about American history and government. Discussions about democracy and freedom. At first, he attended out of boredom. Then he attended out of curiosity. Finally, he attended because he was learning things he had never considered. A young American lieutenant taught a class about the American Constitution. He explained the separation of powers, how the government was divided into 3 branches, how each branch checked the others. how no single person could hold all power. In Germany, we gave all power to one man, Kramer said during the discussion. We thought strong leadership required absolute authority. We were wrong. The lieutenant nodded. That is the beginning of wisdom, General. Understanding where you were wrong. Kramer received his first letter from his wife, Anna, in July. The Red Cross delivered it along with letters for hundreds of other prisoners. His hands shook as he opened the envelope. Anna's handwriting covered 2 pages. She wrote about surviving the bombings, about American soldiers giving food to German children, about the occupation being strict but not cruel. She wrote that she was proud he was alive. She begged him to come home safely. He wrote back immediately, telling her about the camp, about the treatment, about the things he was learning. He did not mention his shame about the camps. Some things were too heavy for letters. Colonel Ernst Richter stood outside the barracks watching a baseball game. American guards played against German prisoners on a dusty field behind the mess hall. The Germans were terrible at it. They kept missing the ball and running to the wrong bases. The Americans laughed, but not in a mean way. They shouted instructions and encouragement. It was the strangest thing Richter had seen in 6 years of war. "You want to play?" A voice asked in German. Richter turned. An American sergeant stood there, young and sunburned with a friendly smile. His name was James Wilson. He worked the afternoon guard shift and often talked with the prisoners during recreation time. "I do not know the rules," Richter admitted. "I can teach you. It is not so hard." Over the next weeks, Wilson did teach him. They met most afternoons when Wilson's shift ended. They threw the baseball back and forth. Wilson explained about strikes and balls and home runs. Richter was clumsy at first, but he improved. It gave him something to do besides sit and think. They began talking about other things, too. Wilson was from Iowa, a farmer's son who joined the Army in 1942. He had fought through France and into Germany. His unit had seen heavy combat during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. That battle had been one of Germany's last desperate offensives. Thousands died in the frozen forests of Belgium. "My brother died there," Wilson said one afternoon. They sat in the shade of a pine tree, drinking water from canteens. His name was Thomas. He was 19. A German artillery shell hit his position directly. They never found enough of him to send home. Richter felt his chest tighten. "I commanded troops at the Bulge. I ordered the artillery strikes. I may have killed your brother." Wilson was quiet for a long time. He stared at the baseball in his hands. "Yeah, maybe you did. Or maybe it was some other German officer. Does it matter now? Does it matter? I killed your brother, and you teach me baseball. The way I figure it, my brother died fighting an ideology. He died fighting Hitler and everything Hitler stood for. He did not die fighting you personally. You were just a soldier following orders, same as he was. The war is over. Hitler is dead. Germany is defeated. We can choose how this story ends. We can keep hating each other forever, or we could try something different." Richter had no answer for that. In Germany, they had been taught about blood feuds and revenge and racial enemies. The idea that enemies could become something else was foreign to him. Yet here sat Wilson, whose brother he might have killed, offering friendship. They played chess after that. Wilson brought a board from the recreation room. He was a decent player, though not as good as Richter. They met 3 times a week. Sometimes they played in silence. Sometimes they talked about their lives before the war. Wilson described Iowa farms and county fairs and high school football. Richter described teaching literature in Munich and taking his students to see plays and reading poetry with his wife. "You were a teacher?" Wilson said with surprise. "I figured all you German officers were career military." "No, I studied German literature at university. I taught for 5 years before Hitler came to power. Then everything changed. The government needed officers. I was young and fit. They trained me and promoted me quickly because so many experienced officers were killed in Poland and France." "Do you think you will teach again?" "After this, if they let me. If anyone wants to hear from a man who followed Hitler, they will," Wilson said confidently. "Germany will need teachers more than ever. Someone has to help rebuild what was destroyed." General Kramer continued his work in the library and his conversations with Major Hayes. They met twice a week now. Hayes never asked about military secrets or troop movements. Those things did not matter. Instead, they discussed philosophy and history and the nature of duty. Were you just following orders? Hayes asked during one session. That is the defense many German officers use. I was just following orders. I was following orders, Kramer said. But that does not remove my responsibility. I chose to follow those orders. I chose not to question them. I chose to believe that my oath to Germany meant obedience above everything else. I was wrong. An oath does not excuse moral cowardice. Hayes looked impressed. That is a hard truth to admit. I have had much time to think here. In some ways, this prison has given me more freedom than I had in Germany. Freedom to think clearly without fear. To read in censored books. To face what we did. The camp received packages from the Red Cross. Inside were letters and small gifts from home. Kramer received more letters from Anna. She wrote that American occupation authorities were organizing local governments in the German cities. That schools were reopening. That food supplies were improving slowly. She included a photograph of their daughter, Maria, now 15 years old. He barely recognized her. She had grown so much, General Weber struggled more than the others. He was a proud man who had difficulty accepting defeat. He refused to attend the educational programs. He barely spoke to the American guards. He spent his days sitting alone, staring at nothing. You should come to the discussion group, Kramer told him one evening. It helps to talk. Talk about what? How we were defeated. How everything we fought for was wrong. I cannot accept that. Then you will die bitter and alone. The war is over, Friedrich. We lost. We must find a way to live with that. You have given up. No, I have faced reality. There is a difference. But Weber was not ready to hear it. Some men adapted to the truth quickly. Others needed more time. Kramer understood that. He had needed time too. The camp showed a film in the recreation hall one night. It was footage from the Nuremberg trials that had started in November 1945. Nazi leaders sat in the dock facing judges from America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and others. The evidence presented against them was overwhelming. Documents, testimonies, photographs, the systematic murder of millions laid out in excruciating detail. Kramer watched with hundreds of other prisoners. The room was silent except for the film projector. When it ended, nobody spoke. They filed out slowly, each man alone with his thoughts. That night, Kramer wrote another letter to Anna. He told her about the trials, about the evidence, about his own guilt for not stopping it when he could have. He told her he hoped to come home someday and help rebuild Germany into something better, something that would never follow a monster like Hitler again. He sealed the letter and gave it to the Red Cross representative the next morning. The winter of 1946 was mild in Mississippi, but General Heinrich Kramer felt cold anyway. News arrived from Germany in scattered reports. The Nuremberg trials continued. Some Nazi leaders were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. The German people faced a harsh winter with little food and destroyed cities. The occupation continued under strict control. In Camp Clinton, life continued its strange routine. Work details, educational programs, letters from home, baseball games in spring. The prisoners had been enemies. Now, there was something else. Not quite free, but not quite prisoners in the traditional sense either. They lived in a space between war and peace, waiting to learn their fates. Major Hayes called Kramer to his office in March 1947. Nearly 2 years had passed since Germany's surrender. Kramer was 54 now, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines in his face. He entered the office and stood at attention out of habit. "Sit down, General," Hayes said. "I have news." Kramer sat, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had both hoped for and dreaded. Whatever Hayes said next would determine the rest of his life. "The review board has completed your case. You commanded troops in combat, but you followed the rules of war. You did not commit war crimes. You did not participate in the Holocaust or other atrocities. Your record is clear. You are approved for repatriation to Germany. You will be released next month." The words took a moment to register. Released. Going home. After 2 years of captivity, he would see Anna and Maria again. He would sleep in his own bed. He He would walk German streets as a free man. "Thank you," Kramer managed to say. Hayes smiled. "You have changed during your time here. I have watched it. You came here expecting execution. You leave understanding something different. I learned that strength and mercy are not opposites, that even enemies deserve dignity. That true victory comes not from crushing your opponent, but from showing them a better way. Will you take that lesson home with you?" "Yes. Germany needs to learn these things. We need to build something new, not try to resurrect what died." Hayes opened a drawer and pulled out a small American flag. It was the kind that children waved at parades. He handed it across the desk. "Keep this. Remember what you learned here. Remember that nations are judged not by how they treat their friends, but by how they treat their enemies." Kramer took the flag carefully. "I will remember. I will teach others to remember." Over the next weeks, other prisoners received similar news. Colonel Richter was approved for release. Major Steiner was approved. General Brandt was approved. Even General Weber, despite his resistance to re-education, was cleared. Only those who had committed actual war crimes remained imprisoned. The rest would go home. On his last day, Kramer found Sergeant Wilson on the baseball field. The young man was teaching a new group of prisoners how to throw properly. He saw Kramer and jogged over. "I heard you are leaving tomorrow," Wilson said. "Yes. After all this time, I am finally going home." They stood awkwardly for a moment. They had spent 2 years as guard and prisoner, then as something like friends. Now they were saying goodbye, probably forever. "I wanted to thank you," Kramer said, "for treating us with humanity when you had every reason not to. Your brother died in the war. You could have been cruel. Instead, you showed me what America truly means." Wilson shook his head. "I just did my job. Besides, you guys made it easy. Most of you were decent once you stopped being Nazis." They shook hands. Then, impulsively, they embraced. Guard and prisoner. Enemy soldiers from opposite sides of the worst war in history. Brothers, in a strange way. The train ride back to Germany took 3 weeks. They traveled by bus to the coast, then by ship across the Atlantic, then by train through France into occupied Germany. Kramer watched Europe pass outside the window. He saw destroyed cities slowly rebuilding. He saw people working to clear rubble and plant crops. He saw American, British, and French soldiers everywhere, maintaining order. Anna met him at the train station in Hamburg. She looked older, thinner, but her eyes were the same. They held each other and wept. Maria stood nearby, now 17, almost a woman. She barely remembered her father, but she hugged him anyway. Their apartment had survived the bombing. It was small and shabby, but it was home. That night, lying next to Anna after years apart, Kramer told her everything. About Camp Clinton, about the American treatment, about what he had learned, about his shame for not resisting Hitler, about his hope for Germany's future. "We can rebuild," Anna said. "Not the old Germany. Something new. Yes, something better." Kramer kept his promise to Hayes. He spoke at schools and community centers about democratic values. He talked about the American guards who treated him with dignity. He taught young Germans about the dangers of following leaders blindly. He became known as a voice for reconciliation and change. General Brandt became a teacher too, working with children in Munich. Colonel Richter helped establish programs to bring together former enemies for dialogue. Major Steiner wrote articles for newspapers about the importance of questioning authority. Even General Weber eventually softened and admitted that the Americans had shown them a better way. The years passed. Germany was divided between East and West. The Cold War began. But in the West, democracy took root. The lessons learned by men like Kramer helped shape the new Germany. They taught their children to question rather than obey, to think rather than follow, to choose compassion over hatred. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, a reunion was organized. Former prisoners of Camp Clinton and their American guards gathered in Mississippi. Kramer was 82 years old, walking with a cane, but still sharp. Sergeant Wilson was there too, now 62 with grandchildren. They embraced again, old men remembering when they were young. Around them, dozens of other former enemies greeted each other as friends. Germans and Americans, once locked in total war, now united by shared memories of an unusual prison camp. Kramer gave a speech that evening. His voice was weaker than it once was, but his words carried weight. We came to America as prisoners expecting death. We found humanity instead. The Americans won the war with weapons and courage. But they won something greater with compassion and principle. They won our respect. They won our minds. They won the future. The true measure of a nation is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies. America taught us that lesson. We took it home and helped build a better Germany. This is the greatest victory of all. The audience applauded, Germans and Americans together. Wilson stood and raised his glass. To peace. To understanding. To choosing something better than revenge. They all drank to that. Later, Kramer stood outside in the Mississippi night, looking at the stars. He still carried the small American flag Hayes had given him 40 years earlier. It was faded now, the colors dull, but its meaning remained bright. He thought about the scared German general who had arrived here expecting execution, about the journey from fear to understanding, about how enemies could become brothers if given the chance. The story of Camp Clinton proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could break through. That compassion could triumph over hatred. That the choice to treat enemies with dignity could change the world. It was a lesson Kramer would carry until his final day. A lesson he hoped would never be forgotten.